Good afternoon. I'm Gordla Weiss-Sussex. So I'm one of the co-directors of the CCWW, which is the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing. And I'm just really here to say a very, very warm welcome to everybody. And a huge thank you to Raquel and Hani for putting together what is an amazing program. It really is. It's really multifaceted, and what I particularly love is that it's spanning cultures. So we have the comparative angle, but it's also, spanning quite a large temporal frame. So today, starting with the early 20th century, and then go moving on as the series moves on. I think it's really, really fantastic. So there's a lot of work involved in putting this together, and I'm really, really grateful to you for doing this. I just want to use this very quickly also to explain. So these series, these online series, are open basically to anyone who wants to host them. They are really for either doctoral or young researchers, so early career researchers, to gain experience in putting together programs like this and hosting them. So if you're interested in doing something like this, the next call will be in the summer, and just get in touch. But now we're here for life writing, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gordilla, for that kind introduction. And thank you everyone for coming. It's fantastic to see so many people here. We've got a really excellent lineup of speakers, as you already know. So we're really delighted that you've been able to come along and see them. So we're very pleased today to be launching our 5-week-long series, and we are hugely grateful to everyone at the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing for making it possible. So Gordella, Shirley Jordan, Lorraine Ryan, Kathy Collins, and the colleagues who initially reviewed our proposal for this series have been incredibly encouraging from the outset. And we feel really lucky to have this opportunity to collaborate with such a fantastic centre. And if anyone's not familiar with their work, it's really worth having a look at the website. So there are great resources on there in terms of author pages for post-1968 women's writing across Catalan, Galician, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. And they also run really great events as well, both in person and online. So Raquel and I obviously felt that this was the ideal place for this series in the light of our aims in putting it together, which Raquel is going to talk a bit more about in a minute. And we're really looking forward to seeing where the conversations, so in the course of and beyond this series, will take us. So as I said, we are hugely grateful to our speakers for their willingness to participate, but also for their enthusiasm and encouragement throughout. We really couldn't have put it together without them. So thank you very much, all of you, for that. And I'll now hand over to someone else whom I'm enormously grateful. So my wonderful co-convener, Raquel Fernandez-Menendez, whose brilliant idea this collaboration was to begin with, and who's very much kept me and the project on track throughout. So thanks very much, Raquel.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Hani, because, well, you thank already everybody, and we are truly grateful for the generosity of our speakers. So I'd like to begin by thanking you specifically. Yes, I came up with the idea of preparing a seminar series motivated by the connections between our research and the activities of the CCWW. And Hani, as always, she responded positively very quickly. But she also expanded my initial vision. As many of you may know, Hani has written a book, Relational Responses to Trauma in 21st Century French and Spanish Women's Writing, published by Oxford University Press, which offers the first study on some of the questions we'll be working on in the coming weeks. So what was initially conceived as a small seminar on women's life writing in Spain soon led us to a comparative perspective, something Hani had already explored in her book. We decided to consider 3 Southern European countries, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, that share important similarities regarding the experience of fascism and dictatorships in the 20th century, and they have also been underrepresented in contemporary theoretical debates on life writing. From this point of view, this seminar series aims to establish the groundwork for future initiatives where additional countries hopefully will be added. The series is organized chronologically, as you have probably seen in the program. This first session examines authors who've been connected in some way or another to the avant-garde period and modernity, a crucial moment in the emergence of women's life writing in Southern Europe. It will be followed by a session dedicated to the post-war period next week, so I encourage everybody to sign up for the second seminar if you haven't done that already through the web page of the CCW. We are also addressing the role of minoritized language in Spain in shaping collective identities through life writing, a perspective we also aim to keep exploring in the future. We've chosen the words forms, fragments, and fractures because in different ways they allow us to rethink a view of life writing as a coherent depiction of the self. Instead, these words embrace, from our perspective, incoherence, incompleteness, and even silence as crucial in addressing the complexities of gendered subjectivity. The image from our poster is a cubist composition by Spanish painter Maria Blanchard, which we are reproducing with the permission of the Reina Sofía Museum in Madrid. We thought that few paintings could depict the forms, fragments, and fractures as well as it does. Without further ado, I'll pass it over again to Hani to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Raquel. So we're delighted to have with us today Ursula Fanning, who is Professor Emerita of Italian Studies in the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics of University College Dublin. And I think I speak for everyone there when I say how delighted they are that Ursula is still very much a part of the school. So Ursula has published extensively in the areas of 19th and 20th century women's writing, including a monograph on Matilde Serrao's Woman as Subject. Her Italian women's autobiographical writings in the 20th century, Constructing Subjects, was published by Feli Dickinson University Press in 2017. She has also co-edited volumes on Serrao's transnational reception with Gabriella Romani and Catherine Mitchell. So Matilde Serrao International Profile, Reception and Networks by Classique Garnier in 2022. And more recently on Elsa Morante, the title is 50 Years of La Storia, Elsa Morante, Beyond History, Danistica 2024. And her paper today is entitled, sorry, Ursula, are you all right getting the PowerPoint up while I'm carrying on? So brilliant, thank you. Her title today is Sibilla Aleramo, Fracturing Forms, Negotiating Self-Representations. Thanks very much, Ursula, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Hani. I want to start off by thanking both of you, yourself and Raquel, for organising what promises to be a really fascinating seminar series, I think. And also a big thank you to the CCCW, of course, for giving us the opportunity to consider life writings by women from Italy, Portugal and Spain in the 20th century, putting them in dialogue with each other in a way in which they haven't been previously heard and seen necessarily. And of course, for the invitation even to contribute to the series. It's a real honour and a real pleasure to get the ball rolling on all of this. I'm sorry I can't let you all see the full screen. We've tried this before we started the seminar proper, and for some reason my Zoom just won't allow me to do that. So we're just going to have to go with the slides on the slide and then the other slides, but we'll see how that goes. Anyway, it should be fine. So without further ado, to Sibilla Aleramo, and to what I consider to be her groundbreaking and germinal 1906 novel, Una Donna. It's an extraordinary work, I think, for both what it says and how it says it. It's provocative in its context for its representations and questioning of social norms as they pertain to women, for its representations and questioning of motherhood and of the maternal. It is in part the story of a woman who leaves her son and her violent marriage, literally to save herself, and that's fairly closely, but not precisely, mapped onto Aleramo's own experience. It's also a provocative text in terms of its representations of the female body and of what is sayable in narrative, particularly, I think, in female-authored narrative at the start of the century, in relation to that body and in relation to its feelings. Excuse me. For example, rape is one of the relatively early experiences in the narrative, which alienates the narrator from her body in a manner which is really strikingly modern in its representation. And also, the corporeality of the maternal experience, as we'll see towards the end of this paper, is also central to the work, and I think is also startling for its time. So I'll begin with the question of form, because this is an integral part of the reception of the text from its first appearance onwards. When Una Donna first appeared in 1906, it was published anonymously. And indeed, it's worth noting that its first-person protagonist is also anonymous, as is the entire cast of characters surrounding her. So these last are identified only by their relationship to the protagonist: my mother, my father, my husband, my son, and so on. So in part because of its subject matter, and also, I think, for the ways in which it puts the laws of the new Italian state with regard to the position of women in the family on trial, the anonymity of authorship caused a kind of critical crisis. And in some ways, that critical crisis was not unlike the furore that we've seen much more recently in relation to the work of Elena Ferrante. One of the core critical concerns around the text then from the outset was precisely the question of genre and of form. What kind of book is this? Is it an autobiography or is it a novel? And an early review of Una Donna, just after it was published by the established critic Ugo Ietti, hedged its bets. He suggested that this was a finzione di romanzo a sostegno di una tesi. You've got the translation in English there on the right. O se è vero che il libro sia un'autobiografia, esempio vivo e franco di una nuova morale. Very closely after that, the poet and literary critic Arturo Graf found himself uncomfortable using the term novel in another review from 1906. And he says, "Mi accorgo di aver parlato di questo libro come dei romanzi non si usa parlare, ma ho già detto che questo non è propriamente un romanzo." So it seems to have been initially the apparent sincerity of the book that struck a chord with its readers and struck them most strongly. And it's that quality that appears to have been, in the first instance, what debarred this text from the category of novel and labelled it, if you like, as autobiography. So from the start, it was a text that posed questions around form and genre. And interestingly, even once Aleramo's identity was revealed and the overlap with her own life experiences became known, along with the fact that she herself always called this text a novel, debates around the generic classification of continued. The nature of the debates changed, of course. In his 1950 preface to the work, Emilio Cecchi, the critic, was reasonably happy to allow for some crossover between categories, and he defined Una Donna as un romanzo francamente autobiografico. In 1991, Leah Corti, the philologist and literary critic, returned to the question in her preface to the text, the new edition of the text. And here she was teasing out the issue rather differently. And she mused, "Insomma, la struttura del romanzo è autobiografico. Lo sono certi personaggi. Lo è l'aspirazione della protagonista a scrivere, a entrare nel mondo della cultura e della riflessione sociale. Però, se molti sono gli elementi autobiografici, il libro non può dirsi come genere letterario un'autobiografia,
ma è un vero romanzo. Dove sta allora il divario? Direi proprio a livello di scrittura, cioè distacco dalla referenza. The ground of the debate has thus shifted considerably over time, moving from initial notions of sincerity to questions of style and semiotics. And it's interesting that even very recent critics take very different positions on the form of the work. For Enza De Francisci, in 2021, Una donna is a novel. For Serena Bassi, in 2022, it's a memoir. While for Nicoletta Mandolini and Olga Campofreda in 2024, the work is an unorthodox autobiography. So the debate on the form of the work and the conundrum it poses in that respect goes on, although the debate itself takes place on shifting ground. For what it's worth, I've always read it as a novel, and that's, I suppose, partly in deference to Aleramo's own wishes, but not only that. We can talk about that later if you like. Going back to Aleramo herself, she was highly sensitive to issues and questions of form, both in relation to this work and actually throughout her writing career. And in chapter 11 of Una donna, she openly expresses the wish to tell her story in una forma nuova. So this desire for a new form then ties in with her criticisms of what she sees as stereotypical and repetitive representations of female characters in Italian literature from its inception. And she says, quasi tutti I poeti nostri hanno finora cantato una donna ideale, che Beatrice è un simbolo e Laura un geroglifico. So here she's obviously talking about Beatrice and Laura, Dante and Petrarch's iconic figures, and saying that from then on, really, there's been, I suppose, a kind of a mold, a die has been cast, and from there, Italian representations of women in Italian literature have taken their starting point. So this is a text that fairly groans with the weight of intertextual reference. Aleramo was constantly measuring her work against that of other writers, and she's constantly setting out to try to claim a different kind of terrain. And Paola Polselli has noticed this when she defined Una donna as attraversato da continui riferimenti al patrimonio culturale e al mondo della letteratura in particolare. And it's worth noting, I think, in passing, the very masculine weight of that literary culture in the Italian context, not least, in fact, in the realm of the autobiographical. So Aleramo certainly has a sense of the kind of revolutionary work that she would like to write in terms of that literary context. She wanted to produce a work that would be new in focus as well as new in form, and she talked about wanting to write un libro, il libro, quel libro che sentivo necessario. Un libro di amore e di dolore che fosse straziante insieme fecondo, che mostrasse al mondo intero l'anima femminile moderna. So this is her aim. And what she undertakes here, in keeping with this new form that she's striving for, is in effect the writing of an early 20th century Kunstlerroman. So it's the birth of the artist as writer, or the writer as artist, of the woman writer as artist in particular. It's the story of how she comes to write, as well as the story of how the life affects the writing. And it is, as much as anything else, a narrative of finding one's feet as a woman at that time in the literary world. And it's a story of alliances and friendships, predominantly between women, that make a way of being beyond the family possible. Related then to this question of form or forms is the question of self-representation and of fractures within the self. And the protagonist here is figured variously in different familial roles. She's daughter, she's lover, she's wife, she's mother, and of course she's also a writer in a person who's coming to writing, if you like. And these roles often conflict with each other, and they lead in some surprising directions. In exploring the protagonist's role as future wife, Aleramo focuses on the seductiveness, not just of the idea of romance, but actually of the romance plot within her text. And she also goes on to try out different variations of it. And she tells us quite early on, come molte fanciulle alle quali le letture dei romanzi suscitano immaginazioni informi, immaginavo un compenso a venire di ebbrezze ineffabili. And these keep turning up again and again in the text. Nonetheless, marriage, like other shadowy potential relationships with men turns out to be destructive on both physical and existential levels. The romance plots that Aleramo overtly experiments with, the marriage, the almost affairs that she shows us, are ultimately rejected, and the protagonist focus pivots resolutely back to the formative relationship with her mother, constructing what we might best define first as an intensely daughterly discourse. That discourse moves on then to the symbiotic bond with the son, and it takes in along the way and through the protagonist's experiences as both daughter and mother, the range of contemporary societal expectations around motherhood and the maternal. Aleramo's rage at these social expectations, and in particular at maternal stereotypes, bubbles over in a long paragraph that I'll just give you a brief flavour of here. And it's a very famous passage. It's become a very famous passage from the novel. Perché nella maternità adoriamo il sacrificio? Donde è scesa a noi questa inumana idea dell'immolazione materna? Di madre in figlia da secoli si tramanda il serraggio. È una mostruosa catena. Se una buona volta la fatale catena si spezzasse e una madre non sopprimesse in sé la donna e un figlio apprendesse dalla vita di lei un esempio di dignità. And I think in this, there's a lot going on in this particular citation, this particular passage, and it's worth remarking on, 3 features for sure. We have, first of all, potential rejection of maternal self-sacrifice, and that ultimately plays out in the protagonist leaving her marriage, leaving her son, effectively in her learning from what her own mother did not do. So it's a kind of inversion of that monstrous chain. And there is then, of course, the striking image of the monstrous chain itself. It becomes a refrain through the text. It passes through generations and social classes that Aleramo represents in the text. And then last but not least, there's that mother-woman split, that fractal representation, which also recurs repeatedly and which sends us right back to the title with its multiple meanings. Because this narrative then, Una Donna, is the story of a woman, not in the end the story of a mother, but of a woman who has on some level set out in the course of the writing to redefine herself. And it's not just the story of a woman, but it's a story of a kind of every woman. So Una Donna is a woman, if you like, in more than one sense. This figure stands as emblematic of the many female characters that are depicted here on all social levels. So on the one hand, then, Aleramo is negotiating self-representation by provocatively, for her time, juxtaposing this image of woman and mother. And in this work, I think we encounter a particular kind of self-division, a particular kind of discontinuity, which takes place precisely within the context of the socially accepted, even socially expected, role of mother. And Aleramo pinpoints it actually very early on, long before her protagonist is a mother, regularly, when she has her protagonist saying, "In me, la madre non si integrava nella donna." So this is the very idea of motherhood, just doesn't fit with this idea of being a woman. E le gioie e le pene contrastavano con un'instabilità di cui conoscevo l'origine e che mi facevano giudicare da me stessa un essere squilibrato e incompleto. So she's aware that there's no possibility of measuring up to the stereotype, if you like. So in a context in which the preferred female role par excellence was a maternal one, this would have been really striking. The historian Fiorenza Taricone has noted how at the time of the formation of the state, women's primary function in the new nation was figured as familial and hence maternal. And another very well-known historian, Annarita Buttafuoco, speaks very rightly, I think, of a cult of motherhood, which she locates between the 1890s and the advent of fascism, and we all know about fascism and motherhood as well. Small wonder then that the choice of Aleramo's protagonist to leave her marriage and her son caused another critical crisis for readers of the novel, this time a moral one. The same Oyetti who dithered over the form of the text and didn't quite know what to call it was crystal clear when it came to his moral judgment on it in his 1906 review. And he says, "Resta il giudizio morale e la tesi che balza su da certe pagine del libro, io la combatto apertamente." So this idea of the novel as a thesis, if you like, against the stereotypical expectations of motherhood, he just couldn't swallow effectively. And the writer Virginia Ormonis stated in a review the following year that nel libro l'unica vittima è il figlio. Against these positions, we have the view of the physician and criminologist Gina Lombroso, who found the most important element of the book to be the fact that it held up familial law in the early 20th century to scrutiny. And she says, most importantly, that the book showed that le nostre leggi familiari sono mostruose. Much later, in her 1973 preface to the book, the journalist, writer and politician Maria Antonietta Maciocchi claimed the text as una battaglia a morte dentro e contro la sovrastruttura morale egemone della borghesia. And later still, in a 1990 article, the critic Fiora Bassanese defined the text as a manifesto, which attacks both the legal system and the structure of the family. Aleramo certainly draws attention in Una Donna to what was known as the patria potestà, that was the power held by the male head of the family over his children, and she shines a light on the concomitant lack of power of the mother. It was fundamentally this vesting of power in the father that meant that her protagonist, and in real life she herself, had to leave her child behind when she left her marriage. And wasn't actually until 1975 that Italian family law changed in that particular respect, allowing equal rights to both mother and father in terms of their children. So it would be relatively easy, with Aleramo's excoriating views on cultural expectations of motherhood, with her laying bare of maternal powerlessness within the family at that time, and with her evocation of this split self divided precisely between the role of mother and that of woman, to characterise Una Donna as a political tract against motherhood. But it's actually more than that. And in a way, it's more unsettling than that, even, in the context. One of the ways in which Aleramo further complicates her self-representations is focused precisely in her portrayal of the self as mother and in her accessing of a maternal voice. And this is one of the areas where she pushes the limits of what is sayable in narrative, particularly in relation to the female body. The corporeality of the maternal experience represented here is still, I think, striking today. In terms of an overt embodiment of the maternal, the graphic descriptions of childbirth for the time are really arresting. It's figured as a near-death experience, one that involves, the protagonist tells us, a sundering of the self. And she tells us, io avevo creduto di entrare nella morte nel punto in cui mio figlio entrava nel mondo. Aveva gettato un urlo di rivolta in nome della mia carne lacerata, delle mie viscere divorate. So the body is literally rendered here. And the labouring woman is both subject and object of a division in process. The intense and lengthy centralising of the physicality of motherhood, literally from the inside out, breaks new ground, really, in Italian literature. But there is another equally fascinating side of the coin, and that resides in the fact that these intensely negative corporeal descriptions are offset by their counterparts in jouissance. There is, to give just one example, a real physical pleasure in breastfeeding for the protagonist. Quando sporsi la piccola bocca succhiare avidamente e ascoltai la gola ingoiare il liquido che sgorgava dal mio petto, mi sentivo un benessere delizioso per tutte le membra. So the female body is racked, threatened, almost dismembered, then remembered and pleasurably engulfed here, all within the space of a few paragraphs. It's literally 2 pages of the text that we're talking about. So I think Una Donna then is a radical text, not only for its questioning of form and its controversial denouement, but also for its powerful representation of the corporeality of the maternal, and even for its figuration of the pull of motherhood, which is nonetheless clearly and repeatedly represented as threatening to the self. The threat of the maternal, not just of pregnancy and childbirth, which would be completely understandable in the historical context, but also in terms of self-abnegation and even self-annihilation, is inescapable in this work. And the threatening pull of motherhood exists in tandem with a very strange scenario that Aleramo constructs towards the end of the text and that she never really explains. And that's her enactment of a fascinating kind of what I've called a murderous maternal fantasy. And it's towards the close of the text. It's murderous not towards the child, but towards the entire rest of the cast of characters, most specifically the husband. And the protagonist at this point wishes everybody around her to be erased, apart from herself and her son. Lui, mio marito, avrebbe potuto non esistere più. Gli esseri che si agitano intorno a noi muoiono, spariscono. Invece ora, dopo, io e mio figlio soli in questo mondo immenso. Era un sogno ad occhi aperti. So it's not a dream, it's a fantasy. It's a waking dream. She's wide-eyed, she's thoroughly conscious of what she's thinking about here, what she's constructing. And this murderous maternal fantasy could easily be read as dystopian, but it's presented here clearly in utopian terms. In the end, then, I think Aleramo is setting her writing squarely at odds with earlier, predominantly masculine autobiographical discourses. And she does this in part by reconfiguring and refracting the maternal stereotype, but not without having made manifest its power and its potential seductiveness, which is kind of analogous in a way to the seductiveness of the romance plot, all of which is also put to one side and rejected. So notions of integrity and wholeness are undone, including those of unity of form in this narrative. And I think that's achieved in part through its maternal discourse. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Ursula. Thank you so much. What a brilliant start to the series. I think your paper was absolutely fantastic in already raising some of the key questions that we want to address. And thank you very, very much for that. And Raquel, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ursula, for such a detailed analysis of Una Donna, very, very suggesting, and we'll talk more about that later in the Q&A. I'm now presenting Professor Sean de Ros. I'm very happy to be introducing her because on a personal level, she connected me and Hani, and she has always had words of support for both of us, and yeah, just Sean, thank you. Sean de Ros is Professor Emerita of Modern Spanish Studies at the University of Oxford and Lady Margaret Hall. Her research specialisms span 19th, 20th century Spanish literature and visual arts, with particular interests in Hispanic modernism, poetry, cinema, music, painting, and questions, of course, of gender and sexual difference in representation. She has co-edited major edited volumes, including The Cultural Legacy of Maria Zambrano with Daniela Omlor, A Companion to Spanish Women's Studies with Geraldine Husband, and Cruising Fields in Modern Spanish Culture with Federico Bonadio. More importantly, she's the author of two groundbreaking works with regards to the relationships between poetry and painting, Primitivismo y Modernismo, El legado de María Blanchard, and the poetry of Antonio Machado, Changing the Landscape, published in Oxford University Press in 2015. She is presenting today a paper titled Filiation through Affiliation, Mother-Daughter Bond in 20th Century Women's Autobiography. John, whenever you're ready, I remind everybody to.
I can hear some voices. I don't know.
Yeah, please, if everybody could mute their mics. I don't know if I can do it as a host. Yeah, I think you can go on, Sean. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Raquel, and also Hani. And I'm very happy to hear that you are going to publish one of the works of Blanchard, which is one of my favorite painters, as you know, for this series as a sort of cover. I'm going to talk about Delirio y Destino. It is a memoir written in 1952 by the Spanish philosopher Maria Zambrano when she was 48 and living in exile in Cuba. So the book was first published in 1988. The subtitle, to see if that works, sorry. The subtitle, Los 20 años de una española, 20 years of a Spanish woman, or a Spanish woman in her 20s. It's misleading because the time span covered goes from the second decade of the 20th century to the end of the Second World War, and this is followed by an aftermath set in the early 1950s. But the focus of the memoir is on the eve of the Spanish Republic, 1929 and 1930. And Zambrano herself is associated with the generation of writers of 1936. So the work fits within the time frame of this session. And also I was glad to see that it sort of overlaps very much with some of the points made so lucidly by Ursula here. The Libre Destino contains a mixture of philosophy, politics, and fiction, as well as autobiography. But the focus of my talk today is on the relationship mother-daughter depicted in the book. The myth of Athena, born from the forehead of her father Zeus, provides a fitting template for a constellation of European women writers of the 20th century that includes Maria Zambrano, together with Rosa Chacel and Teresa León, as well as international figures such as Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, Simone Weil, Natalia Ginsburg, Elsa Morante, Elena Croce, among others. The work favored a type of experiential writing that has been instrumental for the feminist critique of hegemonic discourses, bridging the move from a feminism of equality to the feminism of difference. Like the mythological goddess born without a mother, this cohort of women intellectuals appears deprived of a matrilineal genealogy. Instead, they seem to respond to male precursors. In the case of Zambrano, to her mentor, the philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, in a similar manner as Arendt with Heidegger. So it's not surprising that an allusion to parthenogenesis should appear in Zambrano's confessional novel, Delirium and Destiny, and I'm going to quote from the published translation. There, using the third-person voice, she refers to a debilitating illness that she suffered in her adolescence, during which she experienced a kind of rebirth in terms that closely recalled the myth of Athena. And now she was the one lifting herself towards his forehead, laboriously lifting the weak shoulders, which pulled on the inner wound that opened as she breathed. Halfway through her journey, she found the forehead that held a secret, the forehead whose dream had engendered her point of origin from which she had fled, and also the law, truth, not only because it was in him, in the Father, but because from the beginning he had taught her to love it, to lay everything before it. And now, because she had found the truth, he was not asking her any questions. He was helping her to lie down, to sink rather, to remain there, glued to the white bed, motionless, fixed. But she simply told him the truth she had just discovered. Yes, I am here. I want to be your daughter, born from your dream. Well, the father is the one who introduces her to language and social life, and through him, she meets other literary and real father figures. His ascendancy over the daughter is magnified by his association with Zeus, whereas while the daughter is growing up, the mother is rarely seen and tends to occupy a liminal position, with few references to her presence. At one point, she is described as a ghost. Her mother's black hair would accentuate her rather sunken temples, and her white skin would look pale, as if it were made from something other than flesh. All of her, and she always tended towards a certain incorporeality and seemed very small, although she was rather plump. She would become somehow unreal, but more present than ever, so that she was there as if she had come from another place, from another time, as if her body had not completely materialized or become flesh. It was impenetrable, smooth, and unreal, like a camellia or like a piece of ancient unworked marble. And she would fall silent, feeling self-conscious, look at her small, perfectly drawn hands and raise them like two dove wings. Well, on the rare occasions when the mother speaks, she uses the phrases, "it seems to me," or "it occurs to me," which underline her passive position. Her spectrality is reinforced by vague references to a lost paradise, which is related to an early musical vocation that the writer abandons in favor of philosophy, following her father's desire. Well, up to this point, the narrative seems to illustrate the androcentric psychoanalytic paradigm, situating the maternal in a relationship of negativity in the subject's formation, in which a figurative matricide is necessary to access language and the symbolic aspects of culture. However, at one point in Delirium and Destiny, the focus shifts from a world dominated by men to one centered on female relationships. It is when Zambrano returns to Europe, find that her mother has just died, and she is reunited with her sister, who had stayed in Paris with her mother as refugees during the Second World War. This change is made almost literally on the corpse of the mother, who the writer then associates with a devastated Europe, and by extension, Spain. And mother was also Europe, another shattered mother, one who had gone crazy. And she began to feel what agony is, the agony of her mother, the only mother, who might be in her last agony at that moment. Maybe my mother is dying now. She could not stop thinking about either this or the agony of Europe, her mother in history, her country, which she could not renounce. This identification, established in the final chapters of the memoir between the figure of the mother and the wars in Spain and Europe, complicates the restoration of the maternal bond. In the second part of the book, a series of disconnected narrative fragments are gathered under the general heading of deliriums, populated by phantasmagoria, confinement, corpses, estrangement, sacrifice, and loss that together communicate a sense of distress and dislocation. However, in this scenario of existential and psychic devastation, there are some glimpses of hope for a rebirth. This is already hinted at in the reverse order of the words in the title, where, in contrast with the sequence in the book, delirium takes precedence over destiny. The last chapter of the memoir that records Zambrano's arrival in Paris from America in 1946 begins with an allusion to the myth of Persephone. And here I'm using my own translation because the published one doesn't convey the implications of the original. and she found herself alone with her sister because her mother had descended into the earth 2 days before the plane deposited her at Orly. The myth of Demeter and Persephone is the locus classicus of the mother-daughter relationship. In the myth, the cyclical reunion of Persephone with her mother every spring inaugurates a period marked by the land's fertility. Even if in this case it is the mother who has been abducted to the underworld, the symbiosis between mother and daughter, embodied in the mythical figures of Demeter and Persephone, is implied here and is invoked by Zambrano on several occasions in her subsequent writing, highlighting the association of the maternal bond with creativity. The myth has also been extensively treated by the feminist discourse of difference from a post-Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective, in particular by Luz Irigaray, for whom the idea premise in the myth is that the recovery of the maternal bond lost with the process of symbolization is essential for the creation of a more just social and cultural order. The transformation of this symbolic economy, according to Irigaray, requires the creation or recasting of a feminine mythology, a horizon of transcendence with a specular referential function for women. Part of this project is the deconstruction of the myths that posit male preeminence over women, thereby suppress or exclude it, and the rearticulation of female genealogies. As a correlative practice to this process, Irigaray proposes a feminine writing style aimed at transforming the operative language of culture. There is an affinity between Irigaray and Zambrano in the use of an allusive and elusive style, which, as has been observed in relation to Irigaray's prose, subverts or questions the patriarchal logic from within the discourse itself, inserting female voice in a specular relationship and through ventriloquizing strategies. Among Irigaray's textual resources are these ventriloquizing, in which the limits of what is written and what is read are blurred, a type of writing that undoubtedly contributes to making it difficult to gloss and conceptualize the ideas expressed without resorting to substantial quotation, a phenomenon that can also be observed in Zambrano's work. Referring to the opacity of her discourse, Irigaray proposes a creative communion similar to Zambrano's conception of the secret, which in her texts serves to involve the receiver in the process of creation and recreation of meaning. Both thinkers propose a hermeneutic that requires a type of self-discipline that is always relational. The return to Greek mythology is also a resource promoted by Irigaray to examine the origin of matricide and the consequent rupture of female genealogy, underlining the importance of the mother-daughter relationship for the formation of female identity. Many of the mythological characters of Zambrano's writing also appear in Irigaray's texts, among others, Antigone, Athena, Diotima, and in a prominent place, Demeter and Persephone. Zambrano's Antigone makes her first appearance at the end of the first section in Delirium and Destiny. She is identified with her sister Araceli, who shared her name with the mother, whom she accompanied in the solitude of the Parisian exile. She called her Antigone throughout the entire time destiny had separated them, removing her from the site of tragedy, whereas her sister, Antigone, was having to face it. Well, the symbiosis between mother and daughter is projected onto the figure of Antigone. Like Persephone, the character has access to the psyche's subterranean world and becomes a sort of surrogate in a process of maternal filiation. The final delirium of the book, which corresponds to the epilogue, narrates the arrival by boat of the two sisters at the port of La Guajira, the first stop of a journey that the Zambrano sisters made in 1951 to Cuba, the place that Zambrano had described as the prenatal homeland. In the cabin, the writer experiences a regression to an earlier stage of development, dominated by inertia and close to mental disintegration. When she wakes up from this trance or delirium, she finds herself in front of a telluric, almost prelapsarian landscape. And it is tempting to interpret this self-begetting fantasy projected onto the tropics as a symbolic rebirth into the sensual and generative feminine realm. Yet, in this case, the rebirth is the mother's. She realized that she was smiling as she disembarked, although no one was waiting for her. She was smiling because from the deepest part of her being, a voice, both hers and another's, was answering the call, a call, answering someone who had called her from very far away, imperceptible but imperatively. And she answered from within, yes, I am here, yes, I am here, here still. Well, the first glance seems to repeat the subject's statement directed to her father in the first section of the book. Yes, I am here, has lost some of its resolve. Other subtle but significant changes can also be observed. In the first place, her voice seems to her hers, but at the same time alien, as if two identities have merged into one. At the same time, the phraseology suggests a doubling in of the disemboweled voice in the echo produced by repetition. And finally, the temporal adverb still that projects the past onto the present, together with the phrase in this world, gives a spectral dimension to the statement, which in turn conveys the patient and reassuring tone of the mother's voice. However, the voice that emerges from within the subject is a composite of the two figurations of the mother that, according to Irigaray, have included the possibility of a feminine genealogy. Sorry. Sorry, I forgot the telephone. Where was I? Well, the voice that emerges from within the subject is a composite of the two figurations of the mother that, according to Irigaray, have included the possibility of a feminine genealogy, the overpowering phallic mother whose call is imperative, and the deficient and lacking person whose voice is imperceptible. So instead of mythologizing and idealizing the mother, the daughter lets the mother speak through her, gives expression to her mother's voice. This is the promise projected onto the tropical landscape that closes Zambrano's memoir, and one that will be realized in the voices of other feminine figures, mythological and literary, that populate Zambrano's subsequent writing. So they are not the writer's mouthpieces, as many critics seem to purport. These voices are not instruments for a feminist agenda or otherwise. They are part of a relational network of women's voices. And I've finished here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for such an illuminating connection between Zambrano and Lucy Garay's theories. We'll delve into that afterwards, but for now, I'm presenting our latest speaker for today, Christina Bezari. It's a pleasure to have Christina on board because she really is one of the few people that has developed a comparative approach to Southern European women's writing and also considers the networks established between Southern Europe and Latin America. She is the author of Transnational Modernity in Southern Europe, Women's Periodicals and Salon Culture, published by Routledge in 2022, and the co-editor of Las Vanguardistas, Women and the Avant-Garde in Iberoamerica. She's a senior postdoctoral fellow at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and her research is located at the intersection of Spanish and comparative literature, modernist studies, and translation history. Her current project proposes a comparative study of Spanish and Belgian modernisms and examines the transnational networks that shapes early 20th century literary culture. Christina, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Raquel, for this generous introduction. Thank you to both Hani and Raquel for the organization of this seminar. I'm going to share my slides with you. Let me know if you can see them.
Yes, we can see them, but not in slide mode, not on slideshow.
Okay, is that all right now?
It's taking a bit. Yeah, now we can see it perfectly.
Okay. So when I was first contacted by Raquel for this seminar, I was researching avant-garde periodicals. And I was wondering whether I could find a connection between women's biographies and avant-garde periodicals. So this is quite new. And the research I'll present to you today is quite recent. So I would be happy to receive your feedback and your questions. I'd like to start by saying a few things about the field of periodical studies, the way in which scholars have conceptualized the field so far has considered periodicals as cultural objects, but also as excavation sites, which means that the periodical offers itself to researchers, and we can get an idea of the content and the form and the themes that and the main texts that were published in these periodicals. So I'm talking about early 20th century. So of course we have a vast variety of periodicals, some of which have been digitized and others have not. So I've been working with periodicals that I found online in digital repositories, and I would like to highlight the importance of digitizing a larger corpora of periodicals so that we can get more information on what was published back at the day. Another scholar who has long researched periodicals, Margaret Beetham, has focused on the plurality of the periodical in terms of content, form, contributors, and readership. So when we research periodicals, we have to take into account not just the content, which means the articles, the texts, the illustrations, the interviews, the biographies, but also the form of the periodical, whether it's a periodical or a newspaper, a magazine, or a pamphlet. And of course, the number of contributors, the variety of contributors, were they all from the same place? Were they from different countries? Are the contributors translating from another language? Are they writing in their mother tongue? So a lot of questions that I asked myself while researching this topic. And finally, the readership, which is maybe one of the most difficult themes or the most difficult things to point out. Who was reading the periodicals? So who are these readers? Are we talking about a local readership or a national or an international readership? So are we talking about, for example, the Spanish diaspora living in a place like Paris or London, reading in Spanish? So these are all the questions the periodical studies as a field has been trying to pose to researchers. And now more specifically, I will dive into my case studies today. So I will present to you 3 case studies. So 3 periodicals that I have researched so far. All of them have an avant-garde flair or an avant-garde character. But every periodical is different. So the first one that I researched was edited in Madrid, La Gaceta Literaria. The second one is Arte en Autobiography, which was edited in Barcelona. And the third one, I do not know why you can't see the third one. So there is a blank here. You're going to see it afterwards. So here there was a third periodical. It was edited in Lisbon, and it's a bilingual periodical. So it's edited both in Portuguese and in Spanish. So you're going to see the third case study very soon because I have individual slides for all of these 3 periodicals. In any case, I was able to research 3 periodicals. And again, I would like to highlight the importance of comparative studies and comparing those periodicals because I found a lot of similarities in terms of illustrations, in terms of content. So let's go in detail. So La Gaceta Literaria was published in Madrid. It was a magazine that was edited by Ernesto Jiménez Caballero, and it occupied a pivotal position in the cultural milieu associated with the generation of 1927. The subtitle of this periodical was Una revista ibérica americana internacional. So I would like to reflect on the magazine's pan-Hispanic focus and international reach. So again, it's important to emphasize that the contributions featured in this magazine were coming from different places, mainly from Spain, from Portugal, and from Latin America, but also from other European countries. And when I talk about contributions, again, I talk about articles, literary texts that were translated, and so some translations and also some interviews. And finally, articles that were published not just in Spanish, but also in Catalan. We have a few contributions in Galician, in Portuguese, in Italian. So there is a multilingual focus in this periodic, in this magazine. So today, I would like to focus specifically on the case study of Catalan artist Ángeles Santos Torroella, who was associated with the generation of 1927. She formed friendships with Federico García Lorca and Juan Ramón Jiménez. She combined elements of expressionism and surrealism. And one of her major works, you can see it here, it's called Un Mundo. It was presented at the Autumn Salon in Madrid, and it received critical acclaim in 1929. So she was becoming quite established in the artistic field of her time. And what I found in Gaceta Literaria is an article on the first page. Here you can see the illustration of Ángeles Santos. So it's quite an extensive article. It was written by Ramón Gómez de la Serna, again, very established poet. And I was able to read this article, and I couldn't cite all of it. So I just took a few excerpts and I translated from Spanish into English. I'm going to read the English text, and the people who want to read it in Spanish, you can see it in blue. I have highlighted in blue color for your convenience. So I quote then from the article. Ángeles Santos held a second exhibition at the Lyceum Club, and while I was looking at those paintings, I became aware that I was witnessing something exceptional that transcended the monotony of artistic professionalism, end of quote. Another quote by the same author, by the same, found in the same article, I quote, Ángeles Santos is the harbinger of a breakthrough touching the sky with her hands. And again, another quote from the same article. Angeles spoke to me of her long years in convent boarding schools where she felt abandoned in courtyards of an almost supernatural whiteness. Can you see, she said, pointing to the towering walls of school in Valladolid. I spent several years there. One day I climbed down the street with another girl. End of quote. So here we have a few biographical information regarding Angeles Santos. And from the article, we understand that she was sent to a boarding school. She felt very isolated there. There was a moment of crisis, so there is a description of her emotional world, but there's also a description of her work. And as you can see in the previous slide, Ramón Gómez de la Serna really praises her for her authenticity and the originality of her painting. So these articles have a specific role in the magazine. The role is to give credit to certain women artists, and Angeles Santos is one of them. But of course, we have many, many examples. So here I just chose this example, but we find a lot of articles on women poets, playwrights, authors, artists, actresses, singers. And so I thought it was important to show one of these examples. Moving on to my second case study, it's a slightly different periodical. It's called Arte y Cinematografía. It was edited in Barcelona. It appeared in 1910. It was founded by the playwright Jaume Firmat Noguera, but it was edited by the painter Joaquim Freixas Sauri. It was initially published as a bi-weekly periodical, but it later became a monthly periodical, which is quite common in these avant-garde periodicals that appear for a while, then they disappear. Some of them are short-lived, some of them are longer-lived. This one is a periodical that actually lasted a lot longer because some of the periodicals in the avant-garde movement only last for a few months. So this one, I was quite lucky because I was able to find several issues. So I had access to several issues online. And the content of this periodical basically deals with international news, emerging artists, and cine clubs, such as Cinematografía Nacional Española in Barcelona and other cine clubs. The periodical's final issue appeared in 1936, likely due to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. So it's not by chance that the final issue of this periodical appears in 1936. Here, I would like to focus on another case study of a Puerto Rican woman author. Her name is Carmela Eulate Sanjurjo. She's not an avant-garde author, but she's quite innovative, and it's interesting to see how elements of her life are presented in the periodical. So her literary career began with the novel La Muñeca, followed by other novels such as Marqués y Marquesa, Desilusión, El asombroso Doctor Joven, and Teresa y María. She herself contributed to several periodicals, so she was a prolific writer, but also a journalist for several periodicals, such as Revista Puertorriqueña, La Ilustración Puertorriqueña, El Correo de Puerto Rico, Revista de Cuba. Her essays highlighted women's roles in history and the arts and advocated for women's intellectual contributions. So she wrote a series of essays focusing on different women in history. So what I would like to highlight here today is an article that was published in this periodical on the 1st of January 1931. And again, I will quote my translation in English, but you can also read the original text in Spanish. So the quote goes as follows. Upon turning the final page of El asombroso Doctor Joven, the reader is left with the impression of having read a major work. So imbued with humanity are the characters that one thinks. Not only must all of this have truly happened, but I seem to recall having witnessed some of its scenes, having been a friend of one of these men or women who are not caricatures of a farce, nor mere puppets on a stage, but living beings of flesh and blood. To sum up, Carmela Eulate has written a great novel. So we do not know who is the author of this article, but this article appears in this periodical Arte y Cinematografía. And basically, again, the role of this article is to praise the work of this woman author, but not just to praise it, but also to disseminate her work, make it known. So the readers have the ability to get acquainted with this female author. The biographical writings of Carmela Oulate Sanjurjo herself are a distinctive niche in the early 20th century Spanish language landscape. So basically, she herself wrote several biographies that weren't published in the periodical, but they were published as autonomous books. Her series of biographies, published primarily in Barcelona between the 1920s and 1940s, demonstrate a deep commitment to making the lives of eminent women and cultural icons accessible to a wider audience. So, for example, here we see the biography of Mary Stuart, and among her most notable biographical works were the one she wrote about Mary Stuart and Maria Antonietta, which recount the lives of two tragic queens whose destinies were shaped by the political turbulence of their eras. Another biography with a deductive vision of Isabella I of Castilla as a model of female leadership, aligning with conservative ideals of womanhood while acknowledging women's potential for political power. So I think these biographical writings are important because they're focusing on different models, female models, throughout the history and in different contexts and in different countries as well. So we're not just focusing on Spain and Spanish women, Spanish queens or Spanish figures, but we're also focusing on French, British, Scottish. So we have, even Polish. We have a big array of women and historical figures whose biographies were written by Carmela Oulate Sanjurjo. In this case, it's important to understand that her biographical practice is intertwined with historical narrative, but also didactic intent. So she often addresses a youthful readership explicitly. The choice to frame these stories for younger audiences reflects a broader pedagogical impulse in which women's lives serve as both historical subjects and examples of morality and virtue. Though often overlooked in literary history, Sanjurjo's biographical corpus constitutes an important contribution to the recovery of women's voices, anticipating later efforts to challenge the silence of the historical record. So it's important to see again the parallel between the periodicals and the authors. So here, the sequence is actually interesting. We can dive into the periodical and find out about this woman from Puerto Rico who wrote essays and novels, but at the same time, on the top of all of her writings, we find out that she's written biographies of women. And I think it's interesting to see how this sequence goes. You first open the periodical, then you find out about this woman, and then you find out about these biographies. So it was quite interesting to see how this happens throughout the research process. The final case study that I would like to present to you today is Arte Peninsular. It's a short-lived periodical edited in Lisbon. It was a monthly periodical by Guerra País in 1929. So as you can see here in the illustration, you can see colors. So this is quite new to have colors. Very few periodicals at the end of the 19th century begin to have colors, but then in the interwar period, then we see that more and more periodicals start to use colors, and especially avant-garde periodicals start to use colors and illustrations. So I think that's an interesting feature. The periodical's content encompassed a diverse range of artistic topics, including literature, visual arts, and music. It served as a platform for cultural exchange between Spain and Portugal, which is why you have the title Arte Peninsular. Here we can find different essays, different articles. I wouldn't qualify them as biographies per se, but there are a lot of graphical elements. So instead of a biography in the way that we saw before in the previous example, in these examples, you can open the periodical and you can read an article that includes information on the lives of certain women. Most of these women are contemporary women, so women who lived throughout the period, throughout the 1920s and 1930s. For example, Raquel Meyer, who was an actress and a singer, Concha Mendes, who was an author from Spain, Betta Singerman from Argentina, who was also a singer and a dancer and a cultural icon. And finally, another singer, Adelaida Lima Cruz, who was Portuguese. So again, we have women from several countries, several nationalities, and you can see their illustration. So it's interesting to see how the illustration is sometimes in the middle, and then we have an article on that specific woman. Finally, to reach my conclusions today, I'd like to highlight the fact that biographical information in periodicals allows us to understand the role of avant-garde magazines in advertising and disseminating the work of women artists and writers to a larger audience, but also to transcend national boundaries and engage in cross-cultural exchange. Many of these avant-garde periodicals engaged with other cultures. They also try to disseminate ideas on the importance of women's participation in society. And when we talk about participation in society, it's not just through art, but it's also through education and philanthropy. So we have a lot of examples of women in Spain and Portugal, but also in other countries, whose examples are featured in the periodical. But the most important element that I would like to highlight today is the ability of these avant-garde magazines and periodicals to surpass the strict dichotomy between what we know as the center and the so-called peripheries of cultural and literary production. So the goal of this presentation today, but also the goal of my research, has been to move beyond the strict dichotomy between the so-called centers such as Paris and London and the peripheries such as Madrid and Lisbon, and to slowly move towards a multilingual and multicultural paradigm. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for such a wonderful insight in avant-garde periodicals. Hani, let's start the Q&A, right?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for 3 really fantastic papers. I thought they worked together beautifully, actually, and there were parallels, but also contrasts that I wasn't expecting with respect to the broader questions we're looking at of women's life writing as label, acts of self-representation, and what's going on in that respect with formal experimentation and fragmentation. So I think what we'll do first is open it up to the floor, in case anyone has any burning questions. Otherwise, I can kick us off. And I should say, please feel free to put your cameras on and your mics on, and we'll take your question. Brilliant. Maite.
Sorry, I think I've successfully unmuted. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank all the speakers because, they were brilliant papers. I had a question for Ursula about this sort of dilemma of whether Una Donna was a novel or an autobiography. And I come at it inevitably from my own sort of perspective and angle, but I'm just interested in noting that there's sometimes a resistance by some women writers to that autobiographical label, that idea that it somehow depreciates the value or the prestige of their work. Is there an element of that, do you think, in Aleramo insisting that this was a novel, or do you think it's just not really linked to this anxiety around prestige and perception and reception?
Apologies, I'm sorry, my screen did something funny in the middle there, but I could hear you fine. It's a really interesting observation, and I think you're absolutely right. I would say that later in the century, that's definitely a feature of a lot of the women writers that I've looked at. Funnily enough, not so much with Aleramo, even though she constantly insists that this is a novel. But I think one of the reasons why she insists that this is a novel is because there are disparities, sometimes quite significant disparities, between the story that she's telling about her protagonist and about what actually happened in her own life. And she makes changes, some of which are, I suppose they're done on the basis of suggestions made by other people about what might be more acceptable even though what she's writing is not at all acceptable, but in ways in which she might tone this down, ways in which she might make this look a little bit, sort of less like her own life. For instance, in real life, when she left her marriage, she did not just leave her marriage, if you like, to, in inverted commas, save herself, but also because she was having a relationship with somebody else, with a younger man. And that would have been seen as, even more unacceptable than what she actually represents in the novel. Plus, she changes places. There are various changes in terms of how her family is depicted, in terms of how her family's reaction, the protagonist's family's reaction to her marriage is depicted. So there are lots of changes that are made, some of which she does very consciously and deliberately and off her own bat, if you like, and some of which is suggested to her by other people at a later stage. The reason why I say there's not that sense of wanting to draw a line between a kind of feminization, if you like, of women's writing around autobiography, which has become such a trope. I think at the time it wasn't there. In the sense that, certainly in terms of Italian writing, for the most part, in the autobiographical realm, if you like, it was mostly male writers, and it was men of substance, if you like, the idea of men of substance writing their autobiographies about their important lives and so on. So it wasn't really there at that point. And the other thing is, she writes a lot more after Una Donna. It's all in varying degrees autobiographical. Some of it is poetry, some of it is letters that's exchanged with various lovers later in her life. There are lots of other texts, other diaries. But she always says that her writing is impelled and propelled by her feeling. So she's never keen, if you like, to draw that kind of distance between herself and her writing. It's a different kind of distance that she's drawing. Does that make sense?
Yes, sorry, it took me a minute. Yes. Yeah. So I think some of that comes later, I think. Probably also because she's quite a pioneer I think so. When it comes out,
Yes, I think so. She's not the first. I mean, there was another writer that I could have spoken about today, a woman called Anna Franchi, who wrote a really very out there work, again autobiographical, called Avanti il divorzio, basically, sort of demanding divorce because of a very similar trajectory actually to Aleramo, and a very similar story to Aleramo, with a different kind of ending. But she's not the first, but she's certainly one of the first. And I suppose she's the one who was taken more on board, if you like, ultimately by the critical establishment, not initially, but she became more kind of semi-canonical, if you like, than Anna Franchi did, even though I think Anna Franchi is somebody who, we should go back to, we should be thinking about her too. But yeah, that idea of being one of the first is I think, important. So there isn't that trope of autobiography and women that she has to fight back against. It's not that, it's something else. So, but thanks for the question, Maite. It's a really good one. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. Are there any other questions from the floor? If not, I might jump on Maite's question actually and extend it so both to Jean and Christina, as well as to Ursula, as to what extent are these forms and fragments of self-representation as women and of representation of women more broadly, to what extent are these accommodated by our current understandings of autobiographical and biographical practices, our current prioritization within that research? I wonder, to what extent do these fit? To what extent do they push at the bounds of them? Whoever wants to, Jean, go for it, and you can just unmute. Oh, you've frozen for me, Jean. Perfect.
Now, sorry, this idea of, in a way, of contemporary criticism, of making, in a way, to link the character, if you want, and the writer, and to make it into a sort of that's like a message of what she wants. I mean, some authors like Irigaray uses this feminine or projects herself in those characters, but Zambrano steps back, and going back to the question that made the post, is sort of Zambrano even uses the third person to distance herself from a fixed identity. So in a way, is stepping back from inhabiting the character in the autobiography. So it is a question that is important and is worrying. And I think sometimes contemporary, we tend to read as sort of as if is a sort of utilitarian, and there is a sense of looking around at questions that are not just passing a message through a voice or through their own embodiment of the. It's a more complex question, and it touches on identity and obviously and societal norms, but also a sense of the self, I think.
Can I ask a question without putting the video on, because my technology isn't great right here, right now? Is it okay if I can ask a follow-up question to Jean on this?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay. Really enjoyed all three, and I'd like to ask about this question about she ended with relational network of women's voices, which I thought was a wonderful way to end. And I'd like to ask how that connects with, say, Judith Butler and her normative kinship, her new kinship, which she talks about, particularly with regard to Antigone, and this question of what makes a livable life. And that applies obviously for all three talks that we've seen today, but specifically, how does this, say, Butler's idea of new kinship relate to your relational network of women's voices, or does it not?
Well, first I must say, Claire, it's a privilege to have you here. I remember that reading Claire's article on Zambrano was the first thing that I read on Zambrano, and I was absolutely like mesmerized. And more recently, Claire is the translator of Zambrano's Antigone, which is a real sort of feat, because she's not an easy writer. I don't know if you've noticed in the quotes. So, an Antigone, la tumba de Antigone, Antigone's tomb or grave, is a very difficult word to translate. So, probably, Claire, you are much more prepared to answer this question than I am, I think. And also Hani, that has written so wonderfully about relational poetics. It would be better situated to, in a way, to assess that question of relational poetics, or that going back to the network of voices that somehow they are not appropriated, they are not assimilated, but they are left to tell their stories with their own logic, without interpreting them. And that is the difficult thing that Zambrano manages to do. And I don't know what is your experience as a translator, because really as a translator, you are in a way inhabiting the character. You are doing exactly what she is trying to do with her mother, through her sister, and with other characters, mythological characters that she brings up, like Antigone. So Claire, how was your experience of translating? It's like translating Zambrano.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the ghost passage in Delirio Destino, because the mother is a shadow in Antigone. So the tone is very different there. And also the sister, in fact, two of the main female voices aren't actually interlocutors in the same way as the male characters, and Oedipus and the brothers are, for example. Interestingly, probably the most vocal female character is the harpy. And at that point, I went back to the Felistina, because the goading that she gives Antigone for being virginal, for not, she more or less accuses Antigone of saying, no, you went down to the tomb because you didn't actually want to have a relationship with Haman. And so I looked back at Melibea, I looked back at Celestina, and to a degree, or who Zambrano's also written on. She's also, in terms of theatre, she's also written on Celestina, and she compares Melibea and she compares Antigone. So I went back to that with that voice, and with Antigone's own voice, it just grows so strong. So strong, but also so delirious. And that was, it was that hinge between delirium and strength that I was constantly trying to, I don't think I was trying to balance it, because there's no balance. I don't think that's the point, but I was trying to get both elements to come through in that respect. No idea if I managed it, but we'll see. It'll come out soon. Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, in fact, what you've answered that you are, in a way, going back to La Celestina, is this sort of relational practice that you take all the voices and she speaks, well, she lets all the voices speak. It's not as if she is speaking through their voices. It's very interesting, and you've described it much better than I have, I must say.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire, and it's really great to have you here with us. And thank you, Jean, too. Raquel, over to you.
Yes, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm very grateful that the topic of relationality and alterity, which is closely related to relationality, came into in fact, the three papers. I think I'd like to ask Christina, sort of to close out this round and to connect the three papers. If you think that there's a connection between the proliferation of biographies in avant-garde periodicals, women's autobiographies, or women's biographies, sorry, and the consideration of their work as autobiographical. For example, is Gómez de la Serna thinking that Un Mundo by Ángeles Santos is an autobiographical work? Or what's the relationship between writing a biography and writing an autobiography with regards with Eula de Sanjurjo? I was very curious about that. I'm very curious about exploring this tension through these periodicals and through these artists and authors.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for your question. So the connection between the proliferation of women's biographies and the autobiographical elements that we find. I would say that these women had fascinating lives. Lots of them were multifaceted. They played different roles in society. They also had personal lives and professional lives. So there's an interplay. And the way in which they're perceived by their male peers is not always the same as they perceive themselves. So I think it's interesting to see how they were perceived by male counterparts. in lots of cases, the women form friendships and collaborations with their male counterparts. So I haven't had the time to go deeper into that, but I think that in some cases they were perceived under a positive light because they were friends in real life. In other cases, some of these women were fiercely criticized in the press. So the more you look at the press, the more you find out that women were praised for their capacity to write or to create or to paint, but at the same time they were fiercely criticized. So we have both. I think the fact that that the work was known through the press, or that it became well known through the press, is definitely a reason why a larger readership or larger audience was familiar with the work. So it's hard to count. It's hard to know how many readers read the periodicals. So we cannot know for sure whether these women became famous thanks to the periodical, but for sure it contributed to their fame somehow. So I would say that these periodicals contributed to the dissemination of women's work. Now, to what extent? It remains to be seen. I would say that we need to research deeper and harder on that topic. I don't know if this is clarifying some of your questions.
Fantastic. And I think that's a great note to end on, actually, that need to look at networks to do further research. And yeah, this series is very much designed to be a starting point for some of those further conversations. And I think it's been a really brilliant start today. Thank you so much to our three speakers. It's always really difficult to organize a round of applause online, but we are sending you a really, really big round of applause and thanking you and thanking everyone who has taken the time to attend today. Thank you very much, everyone, and we hope to see you this time next week. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much.